What a great pleasure to be here in the new club and to share with you some thoughts about the man in whose honour we are all gathered and whose memory we treasure. But what a pleasure to be lunching with the Cossets today, with Dora and John, and reflecting. I thought I might just begin with that, John, because I was telling you about a man that we all knew. One of the great doctors that Scotland has produced in the last century. His name was Ian Donald, and he was the professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the University of Glasgow. And he is the man who came up with the idea of ultrasound. And I was there. I was a young trainee in medicine and surgery at the time. When we said to him, Professor Donald, when did you first go public with this idea of scanning people with ultrasound? And I bet that almost every lady in this room who is a mother will at some stage of a pregnancy have had a scan to see how things were progressing with the pregnancy. He was the man who discovered that. He came back from the war, from the Second World War, wondering if a warship on the surface can detect a U-boat floating in the ocean, could modification of that same technique allow the visualization of the fetus in utero, the baby in the womb? And yeah, so we said, when did you first go public? He said, I went to Edinburgh. To give a talk to the Simpson Society in Edinburgh, in which I proposed, on the basis of some preliminary investigational results, that it might be possible to detect the baby in the womb, the fetus in utero, its number, its position, its sex, its welfare, by means of propagated waves of silent sound. And this proposal of mine was greeted by my dear Edinburgh College with such universal scepticism that I knew I was onto something. And if there is another life, if there is a hereafter, his ghost will nod with approval to know that by the latest estimate, which I saw recently in the Lancet, that 500 million babies have been scanned before birth and not one has been harmed. But the tradition of medicine and surgery is still alive and well with us, in both the great cities, east and west, in the central belt of Scotland. But actually also tonight, or this afternoon, all my ideas have been washed away by the discussions around this table at lunchtime today, but certainly triggered also, helped this morning by listening to these excellent recitations or readings from Kidnapped. Which was, of course, one of the novels by which RLS is tremendously well remembered to this day. But I regard him as a friend and a neighbour, not just because I live in the new town and round the corner is 17 Heriot Row, but with its famous red door and the home of John and Felicitas McPhee, who now look after his memory in that famous house. And just with tomorrow, coming up tomorrow, and the New Zealanders in town, I cannot take from you the memory of the arrival of the Samoan rugby team in the 1960s to play their first match against us, and what happened at the airport, where a young cub reporter for STV was charged with interviewing Captain Nuku'alofu, I think his name was, captain of the Samoan rugby team. He was 6 feet 10 inches tall, with a massive afro hairdo and a smile as broad as the Pacific. And this interview is still used in journalism to remind young trainee reporters, do your homework. Do your homework with great care before interviewing anybody, especially from abroad. So the interview took place, and I can still see the interviewer with his microphone speaking up to Captain Nuku'alofu and saying, "Welcome to Scotland, Captain. You and the team are looking forward to the game on Saturday, and I understand that tomorrow you'll have your first training session at Murrayfield." And they go, "Yes, we are going to Murrayfield tomorrow for training session, but we are not going direct to Murrayfield." And the interviewer said, "Hey, no, you'll not be surprised to hear that we are going, first of all of us, to 17 Heriot Row." And it was immediately obvious that the interviewer had no idea whatsoever significance of 17 Heriot Row. And whereupon the captain frowned. "I do hope that your RLS, Tusitana, is as much admired here in his hometown as he is with us? And the interviewer said, yes. Brilliant. Do your homework. And indeed, that game was maybe 50 years ago now, but we welcome our New Zealand colleagues from Dunedin tomorrow. I see there's to be a broadcast from this club tomorrow involving the mayor, not the provost, of Dunedin. And looking behind me here to that wonderful rock, so well known to RLS himself throughout his life until he left for the Pacific, we remember that the city of Dunedin in the South Island of New Zealand is the old title of this town. In the Gaelic language, which preceded the arrival of Anglo-Saxon speaking peoples in the 6th, 7th, 8th century AD, correction, CE as we must now call it, Dunedin was Dun, meaning fort, and Eden means the rock face in the Gaelic. So it was the fortress on the rock face. And when the Anglo-Saxon speaking peoples who gave rise to our beautiful old Scots language, when they arrived, they changed the Eden to, they kept the Eden of the rock face, but added borough for a fortified place in Anglo-Saxon. Hence it's been the city of Edinburgh to this day. So he was of course born in Howard Place, and I had a discussion about that this very morning with my personal chauffeur, Smith. Smith is Nick Smith, who has been a friend for nearly 15 years now, and is in fact my personal chauffeur. He is in fact, of course, an Edinburgh taxi driver, but a deeply intelligent, clever guy, and a historian of this city, who could easily hold down a senior position in academia. How did they know I was here? They could hold down, if he wished, in academia, but in fact he prefers to drive a taxi. And he said, when's your next speech? What are you talking about next? I said, well, I'm speaking to the Robert Louis Stevenson Club. Oh, all right, what about? I said, well, surprisingly, Robert Louis Stevenson. Yes, of course. Now, then he tries me out. He tests me every time we're traveling together. He said, where was he born? I said, Howard Place. What number? 8. That's right. And then, of course, Nick said, then, of course, they removed to 17 Harriet Row. I said, no, they didn't. And it went very quiet. I said, he was born, said Nick, in Howard Place and grew up in 17 Harriet Row, yes, but not immediately. And I thought, I've got him. And in fact, as you all know, there was an intermediate stop by the Stevenson family, number 1, what was the terrace? Inverleith Terrace, that's right, Inverleith, thank you. Number 1, Inverleith Terrace, from which they removed, of course, to 17 Harriet Row, which still bears the name and always will. And then, of course, after that, school days at various schools, private tutoring, of course, various private schools in Edinburgh, but most importantly, I think, the academy. And I remember giving the speech at Speech Day, well, the year after my daughter left the academy, Edinburgh Academy, and reflecting on the fact that there was just a near miss between two of Scotland's greatest minds and writers and scientists of all time. Because RLS was there, of course, for about 15, 16 months at the Academy, which was, remember, in fact, inaugurated by Walter Scott. And one of our other great writers was Scott, of course, who, with Lord Coburn, Henry Coburn, had this idea of a new school in Edinburgh. And I remember quoting in the remarks of that day, the paragraph from the inaugural address given to the school by Walter Scott himself. And he was a great public speaker. We don't often think of him as an orator. He said, you're not here to be taught, he said. You're here to be educated. You're here to be furnished with the knowledge and the skills and the attitudes which, in addition to your own character, will allow you to excel in every area that you choose to exert yourself. Very good. Aien Aristoien, he's finished. He finished in good classical Greek. Aien Aristoien, always excel. And any of the old boys or girls of the Academy here today will confirm that that remains the motto of Edinburgh Academy to this day. But also the other great person who was there, just missing our RLS, was JCM. And some years ago, the Institute of Physics polled their 40,000 members all over the world as to who were the 3 greatest physicists of all time. And there are many famous names in the top 10. Michael Faraday is there, Werner Heisenberg of the uncertainty principle is there, Galileo Galilei is there, but there was no doubt whatsoever about the top 3 physicists and mathematicians of all time. And in their birth order, you'll not be surprised to hear they are Isaac Newton, JCM, James Clerk Maxwell, 14 India Street, born and bred, and the last, of course, is Albert Einstein, born in Ulm in the year that JCM died. Well, what a pity that they didn't cross, but that school to this day can boast having has as its own boys both James Clerk Maxwell and Robert Louis Stevenson. That's a considerable honour. John mentioned that I belong to the SPEC. There'll be other SPEC members here. Yep, 1 or 2 nods. And that is a great training ground for him. He joined at 19, as most of the SPEC members do. He was a student, of course, at the university. After major discussions and disagreements, as you all know, with Tom Stevenson, his father, he would not read he began as an engineer, actually. He began to read engineering, but his heart was never in it, although he did follow his father around the northern lighthouses on 1 or 2 of his visits. No, his idea was always to go for literature. He studied law as a compromise with Dad, and of course graduated and was called to the bar 2 years into his time at the SPEC. And he was very much, I've read backwards in the SPEC notes to the time when Stevenson was a member of the club. There's only 30 members, ordinary members of the Speculative Society. By the way, 1764. It's 20 years older than the new club here itself. Quite remarkable. But it's a training ground. It's a brutally honest and factual training ground for public speaking and oratory and eloquence in front of an audience. And that's where a lot of his talent came from. I think the critical attitude around him. You have to give 3 essays in your time as a member of the Speculative Society. There's no escape. You have to give these essays on a subject which the SPEC will be pleased, in fact, to send to you. And then when you've given your essay, in the semi-darkness of the speculative room, which is lit only by candlelight, there are 15 candles in the candelabra. There is no electric light, there's no gas light, just the candlelight, the flickering shadows around the room, and in the semi-darkness, the members sitting there critically, like a pack of wolves waiting to see if you might be allowed to keep the essay in the archives or not. Because at the end of your essay, there's a debate on its quality and character, on its matter and its manner. And if the vote goes for you, if the Speculative Society is pleased to acknowledge the quality of what has been done, your essay will be added to the archives. All of RLS essays were added to the archives. They are very interesting to look back at our records and see that emerging that quality of grammar and syntax and vocabulary which was to shine out into his essays and his travel writing and his novels later. But if your essay does not please the SPEC, your essay will be taken from you, in front of you, your notes will be taken from the lectern at which you're standing by the secretary, carried across the room and placed in the fire in your presence. I've seen it done twice. It is the nearest thing you'll ever see to a public execution. So it does concentrate the mind wonderfully. We're going to be giving an essay to the SPEC. And of course, one of the great presences in his time was a man who had become his lifelong closest friend, Charles Baxter, his lawyer and his financial advisor, and a man with whom he shared that wonderful command that both of them had, not just of the English language, but remember both of them, and also Walter. There was 2 Walters, wasn't there? Walter Ferrier and
Simpson.
Yes, the son of our colleagues, the professor of obstetrics here, Professor James Young Simpson, who discovered the use of chloroform.
Well, Mitchell took us on a walk around both graveyards.
Right, excellent.
Just this year.
Yeah. The command of the Scots language, which both of them show. Have you seen the correspondence between RLS and and Charles Baxter, it really, their command of Scots is terrific. I belong to the Scottish Language Society, and I speak Scots to my farming cousins in Kintyre when I'm down there. Last time I was there, I knocked on the farmhouse door, and my cousin Malcolm said, David, splendid, how do you do? Good, come in. I said, no. Why not? I said, I'm not going to come in until you ask me in our language. Right, Davy, he said, come away, Ben. So that's exactly what Stevenson did with his chums. They were all fluent in the old Scots language. And that also leads me to a man who was much admired by Scott himself, the aforementioned Walter Scott, who himself was an expert in the Scots language, having spent a lot of his childhood after an attack of polio on his grandfather's farm at Sandy Knowe, just outside Kelso, deep in the Borders. And that his command of Scots was of great value to him, not just in his prose and poetical writing, as it was to RLS. It was also a great use to Scott in his legal work. Because remember that Walter Scott was the senior clerk of session. He sat at the clerk's table in the Court of Session, his duty being to engross the judgments handed down by their lordships on the bench. And on one occasion, I was actually discussing this last night with Nola Miko and others were there at the Scottish Arts Club. On one occasion in the Court of Session, the judge, Lord Newton, was in great difficulty. He was, in Scots, sair tracht by his inability to understand what was being led in evidence by an old Borders dairy farmer from deep in the Borders who did not speak English. He spoke Old Scots with his full graphic imagery and verbal firepower, complete with Borders dialect and diction, leaving his lordship completely at sea. But his lordship could see where help might come from. So he leaned over the bench and apparently said to the senior clerk of session, Mr. Scott, approach the bench. Scott rose, approached the bench, and his lordship said, Mr. Scott, the court must establish, if the defender in this case is a man of probity, an honest and upright individual. So would you be kind enough to put this question to the witness in his dialect? Does he consider that the defender who is in court is a man of probity? Certainly. Scott went over to the witness box and said to the old farmer, His lordship is spearing o ye and then the defender yonder. Would ye hold the traitor to be only wise laughable? And the witness said, I wasn't laughing away a full stick. Scott looked up to the bench and said, no, my lord. And that wonderful facility with the English and the Scots language, inestimable help to RLS in his writing. You don't turn many pages of RLS's great books about Scotland without running into the old language, which he uses with effortless fluency. And of course, it wasn't just in the novels, but also in his poetry. I remember the first time I came across him, I think I was just before I went to the primary school, the high school, in my hometown of Prestwick in Ayrshire. And I remember my mother, or it could have been Granny, my grandmother, reading to me verses that you will all immediately recognise. How do you like to go up in a swing, up in the air so blue? Oh, I do think it's the pleasantest thing that ever a child can do. Now, isn't that remarkable? Just these 4 lines of verse, suddenly you're listening to a child talking. And of course it's him talking, it's RLS talking. But he manages to transmogrify himself into the attitude and the language and the personality of a child. And I still remember that verse to this very, I will always remember that. And then I met him, of course, later through Kidnapped and Katrina. And then I think it was in Scotland, someone will correct me, either at Braemar or at Strathpeffer, on holiday with Fanny Osborne, now Mrs. Stevenson, of course, after 1880, where he, in a rainy afternoon, sat down with young Lloyd Osborne, and thinking, what can I do to lighten the mood, to lighten the weather, and then had this idea about the book to be called The Sea Cook, which we know, of course, today as the finest adventure novel for children ever written. Patchy J.K. Rowling, this is number one. Treasure Island. Nothing quite like it in the history of the Republic of Letters. Nothing at all. And of course, as a former sailor myself, I mean, I was 2 years on the deep sea with the Naval Reserve after medical school. I've always been intrigued by Stevenson's knowledge and his effortless fluency with naval language. And I trace it back actually to his voyages with his father. Twice he went up to the north. He was at Wick at one point on Tom Stevenson's tour of duty of inspection of the aids to navigation, the voyage, and the lighthouses, of course, for which his family, of course, was internationally famous. And in the Cevennes, if you reread Journeys with Modesty, Journey with a Donkey in the Cevennes, you'll find that he was wearing a pilot jacket. He had a knitted waistcoat, he tells us, his gaiters and his boots, but he also had a pilot jacket. Now that's a naval term, and it's a special type of all-weather jacket worn by mariners. And when we see how much he was attached to the sea in his later life, he was navigating the Casco across trackless wastes of the Pacific, effortlessly, and never getting lost, never getting into difficulty. He was a natural sailor. We never hear of him being seasick, but he understood navigation. Again, back with the donkey, with Modesty. Remember, he's traveling with a compass and map. He was mapping his compass as he went. He was a natural navigator. And of course, that was, of course, the ultimate destination to be Samoa after his voyages in the Casco from San Francisco out to the Marquesas, then down to Tahiti, up to Honolulu, where I think he was very much engaged in writing The Master of Bell and Trade. And then, of course, eventually to Requiem coming to rest in the island of Samoa, from which we may view him at a distance of just, by my calculation, over 9,000 miles. And his work there was, again, quite remarkable. He's now into his full maturity. He emerges as a politician. Some work has been done recently on just how active was Stevenson in promoting the welfare of the island and the independence of the island of Samoa. We wanted it. The Americans wanted it. The Germans wanted it. It was a plaything of the great imperial power. Then they ran into him. And in a series of ferocious letters to the Times, wonderfully concise and eloquent letters to the Times, he fought the good fight for the Samoans to be masters of their own affairs, as indeed they are to this day. Quite remarkable. And in fact, there's no doubt at all that towards the end of his life, he was regarded quite clearly as a chief among them. He was a Samoan chief, as well as everything else for which we remember. And when he died, when that dreadful day came in December 1894, there was undoubtedly what is known in the trade as a CVA. He had a cerebrovascular accident of great severity. And actually 2 years ago at the College of Physicians here, we had a very interesting full-day meeting on what killed our three great poets. If that's Nicola Sturgeon for me, the answer's still no.
Please, sir, I'm guilty.
Find a guinea. What happened was that we lost Robert Ferguson, the great poet of Edinburgh, at the age of 24, from what was probably a subdural hematoma after a head injury. We lost Robert Burns at 37 from endocarditis, the inflammation of the inner lining of the heart. But what killed Stevenson? We're told simply it was a stroke. But in fact, it was a rather special kind of event. It was, in fact, we think, what's known in neurosurgery as a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Because he said to Fanny, he was working on the veranda with his wife and his mother there, of course, and other members of the household. Suddenly he had a blinding pain and at the back of his head. Now, the main strokes that people suffer from, cerebrovascular accidents, cerebral hemorrhages and thrombosis, they're painless. But there's a special type of stroke which is painful. And that, I think, is what afflicted him. a subarachnoid hemorrhage is a bleed on below one of the linings of the brain itself. If it's of great severity, it can be fatal almost immediately, as it was in his case. Today, with intervention and neurosurgery, we might be able to save the patient, but not then. And then you all know what happened afterwards, beyond that 60 Samoans, having cleared the path to the top of the Mount Via, they carried him up there and laid him to rest in what is now the catafalque, where he rests to this day. And to this day, rather wonderfully, hunting is forbidden on the mountain, and especially there is to be no discharge of firearms anywhere close to it, in case it disturbs his ghost. Isn't that splendid? And there he rests. And one of the images I have on a lecture on the Enlightenment literature, which touches on Stevenson, I've got a super photograph taken by a Samoan photographer, not side on to the catafalque, but oblique, so that you can see him in the foreground. You can see the catafalque stretching away from the camera. And then the mountainside, and in the middle distance, the town of Apia, the capital of Samoa, and in the far distance, the unmistakable deep aquamarine of the Pacific. Beneath the broad and the starry sky, dig the grave and let me lie, glad that I live and gladly die, and I laid me down with a will. And this be the verse you grave for me, here he lies where he longed to be. Home is the sailor, home from sea, and the hunter, home from the hill. And on that note, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, let us raise your glasses and join with me in a toast for the gentleman who brought us here today, who still lives among us. Ladies and gentlemen, RLS.